Hello the world, hello the internet, hi Jason Isaacs. Let's talk about the EU. Shush. Shush. No, shush. Okay. Clearly the theme music is winding up Poppy a bit. So a few bits of housekeeping before we get on with this. First of all, this is being recorded in a live classroom with a dog and with my colleague teaching next door, with people going past outside and reversing and doing all sorts of things, so it's going to be a little bit noisy. Secondly, there's no way I'm going to get through all of this in one 15-minute session, so this is going to take a couple of 15-minute sessions. And finally, on this section at least, this is not about Brexit. I'm going to try to avoid Brexit as far as possible. So this is just going to be a technical analysis of the institutions of the EU and their general relationship with their constituent members, not just the UK. So anyone who's expecting a rant on Brexit, either for or against, sorry to disappoint you, it's not going to happen. I do have all sorts of ideas on that, and perhaps I'll explore those in a different video. But right now, we're just going to talk about the exam. Now, before I move on from that particular subject, do please note that I do offer online tutorials. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, just drop me a line in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Right. On with the show. So the EU. This is again about the EU and the exam, not Brexit. So again, I won't be ranting about that. Instead, I'm going to be talking about this, the institutions of the EU. And normally I'd spend some time talking about that and these different colours and all the different countries and these people and the fact that we've got a flag and a motto and even a cake, which is really nice. And all of those different languages that are spoken. And this is the way that they came in. But we haven't got time. However, I will talk here about this sense in which the EU has grown over time. And you can see here how various nation states have been added to the club over the last 50 or 60, 70 years. And so it's a fairly steady rate of expansion, which has had all sorts of consequences for the EU as an entity and indeed for the member states. And these are laying out here in these various different treaties. There, they go all the way back to 52, but these are the latest ones, and these are the ones that they're explored in a little more detail, on the little side. These are the ones that are coming in, again, not particularly relevant for the exam. Similarly, this is all about the EU. Just look at that number there. It feels like such a big thing. And then we look at these other entities, not least the United States. And you start to get a sense of why the EU might actually not be that bad an idea. Surface area, this really doesn't matter at all, but it's interesting, again, for the sake of reference. This is much more interesting. Again, if you're having a pub quiz, good to know that France is vast. Absolutely flipping vast. And when it comes to population, Germany is vast. And we are there in the third sort of mid-table on all of these things. Where are we? There we are. So, there. Not much to say about that other than it's just a numbers game. Here we see how, again, the EU has grown over time. What we're seeing here is a multi-layered system of treaties. None of these is a constitution per se. There was an attempt to turn the Treaty of Lisbon into a treaty, into a constitution, but that was not entirely successful. So what we have here is a sequence, or rather a layer cake, if you will, of treaties that essentially lay out the increasing complexity of the EU, because it has just been getting more and more complex. And in that sense, there's a case that it's just got too complex for its own good. But again, that's a whole different set of arguments that I look forward to exploring in a different video. Let's start off with this. So this is what the aims of the EU are. This is essentially what they're trying to do, and this is how they're trying to do it. So this is the end, and this is the means. The extent to which the EU succeeds is the extent to which this has been delivered. Now, promotion of peace and well-being of the Union's citizens. Don't forget that the history of the European continent has, for the last 200 or 300 years, essentially been defined by war and conflict. Just bear that in mind as we go forward. Unfortunately, it's not really a system of peace at present, but arguably it's better than it has been. Again, I don't want to get drawn into this too much, and it seems to be happening anyway. 4 freedoms of movement. Now, this is very important, and also the sense to which it leads to growth. it's all predicated on growth. The idea that if everyone's getting richer, then everyone's getting better. The single market is there to make the EU safer and wealthier. And this is an economic argument that I haven't really got time to go into here. It does work, however. Again, I'm getting drawn into Brexit. So let's just move on. Schengen, the key thing to remember about Schengen is that we have opted out from that. We are not included in Schengen. And this is, again, a key area that some people get a little bit confused about. We forget that there are areas of EU policy we can opt out of. Schengen is one. And the Euro is another. So here we have two areas where we have rejected the UK has rejected a wider European policy, thereby demonstrating sovereignty. Just bear that in mind. So, institutions of the EU. This is very, very important. And there are two types of institutions within the EU. We have our supranational organizations. These are the ones that essentially speak for the EU. And then we have the intergovernmental organizations that speak for the interests of the individual country within the wider aegis of the EU. Perhaps that will become clearer as we go through, but you need to remember that there are entities that speak for the collective and for the individual throughout the entire system that we have here. So, what are those? This is my standard Euro legal triangle, and the best way to think of it is that we have a sort of split executive and we have a bicameral legislature. Now, the split executive, here we have the European Council. Now, this is all about policy. These guys determine policy, and they are the leaders of the individual countries. You'll see there how this represents the nation's interests within the EU. They determine the general direction of travel for the EU. What happens with that policy is that policy is then handed down to the European Commission, whose job it is to take that policy and to turn it into working legislative proposal, or rather sort of EU bills, if you will. Now, I know that I'm simplifying things a lot here, but we have a limited amount of time and there's a limited amount of understanding of this process that you guys need. So the European Commission takes the policy, turns it into legislative proposals, and those legislative proposals go into this bicameral legislature. In this sense, you can see that there is one entity here that looks at the interests of the states, and there's one entity here that looks at the interests of the EU generally, or the people, if you will, the people of Europe. And here it's useful to draw an analogy with the United States, certainly the United States pre-17th Amendment. Now, those of you who are on top of your game here will know that the 17th Amendment of the American Constitution created direct elections to the Senate. Before then, members of the Senate were appointed by their state legislatures. And so here we can look at this as being analogous to the role of the Senate in the US, whereas this is analogous to the role of the House of Representatives in the US, speaking for the people, and these guys are speaking for the states. Again, pre-17th century, pre-17th Amendment, that's what we've got here. It's a bicameral legislature. The mechanism by which decisions are reached in the legislature is fascinating, but it's above the scope really of this of your course, except that it's to do with, it's not straightforward voting, obviously, because we're dealing with the EU. It's double majority, and we'll come to that later. Certainly that's the case with these guys. With these guys, it's a lot more straightforward. It's just a straight up show of hands. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Again, we've got a split executive and we've got a bicameral legislature, and at both the executive level and the legislative level, we have representatives from the nation states and representatives from the EU. So that's an interesting little thing to bear in mind as we go on. These are the people in the major departments, and again here we're talking May 2019, so it may be that these have changed if you're looking at this in the future. What an interesting concept. This is really how that legislation is made. Again, this is the EU Commission, so this is the EU entity. The citizens groups this lot. This really is a proxy for the Council, the EU Council. Those are the leaders, again, of the individual states. So this is half of the split executive. This is your bicameral legislature, and then that gets given back to the nations to implement. Okay. We start then at the very top. This is the summit of the European Council, or just the European Council. You'll see there, those are all the leaders of the nation states. I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't identify individuals, but I'm assuming that that one's Merkel. And we should see Theresa May there somewhere, presumably right on the outside, if indeed she's there at all. Is that her? Who knows? So these are when the leaders of the individual nation countries get together and they make big policy decisions. They are elected, but they are elected by their national constituencies, not by an EU constituency, and that is relevant later. These guys really come up with the policy agenda. They set the policy agenda. The leaders of the national countries determine what the direction of the EU should be. And they don't meet very often, maybe 4 times a year. Yeah, that's about as much as you can say there. They then hand down that policy, that general policy direction, to the European Commission. This is they. What they do is that they take the policy that's been handed down to them by the Council and they turn that into working legislative proposals. This is an administrative entity, or a technocratic entity, and therefore perhaps it's better that they are appointed rather than being elected. This is not really about making decisions. This is about taking decisions that are made at the European Summit and turning them into workable legislative proposals that can then be voted upon in that bicameral legislature. I hope that makes sense. The key point here, again, these guys are appointed. They are appointed by national governments. So we have representatives currently at the Commission representing British interests, whereas here, back in the Council, these are the leaders of the individual countries. It's the prime ministers, the chancellors, the presidents, all sitting there making decisions about the broad policy direction of the EU. That then gets handed on to this technocratic element that is appointed by national governments. So we have there are UK commissioners, there are German commissioners, there are French commissioners, but what they're supposed to do there is they're supposed to check in their nationality at the door and make decisions based upon the well-being generally of the EU, what is generally in the interests of the EU as a collective. So here we have policy decisions being made by national governments and then handed on to an administrative entity that turns those into effective legislative proposals that then get handed on to the European Parliament. Again, analogous, if you will, to the House of Representatives in the US. These guys speak for the people, not the nation states, and it is the people of all of these countries. I'm just about out of time on this particular video. I'm going to stop there, load this one up, and then we'll pick this one up when we come back in the next video. I hope that makes sense. I look forward to exploring these with you in more detail in the next video. See you there.